A cheetah kidnapped a baby gorilla. What happened next is unbelievable. The vast, sprawling continent of Africa is a land defined by its absolute, unforgiving boundaries. Nature, in her ancient and ruthless wisdom, has drawn invisible lines across the earth, separating the impenetrable, emerald depths of the equatorial rainforests from the endless, sun-baked oceans of the golden savannas. These habitats are distinct worlds, governed by entirely different biological laws, and they house creatures that are never meant to cross paths. The mountain gorilla, a colossal, gentle vegetarian, belongs to the cool, mist-shrouded shadows of the dense volcanic slopes. The cheetah, a fragile, aerodynamic marvel of lethal speed, belongs to the open, searing plains where the horizon stretches out to infinity. In the wild, a meeting between these two species is a geographic and biological impossibility. They are ghosts to one another, existing in parallel universes that never intersect. But human interference has a way of violently shattering the boundaries of the natural world, pulling the impossible into reality. This is the heart-stopping, scientifically baffling, and profoundly tear-jerking story of an unprecedented collision of worlds. It is the story of a shattered, grieving predator, a fragile, orphaned primate, and a terrifying rainy night when the laws of nature were rewritten by a desperate, universal need for salvation. Before we plunge into the darkness of the sanctuary to witness this terrifying kidnapping and the unbelievable, emotionally devastating twist that left a team of hardened wildlife experts weeping in the mud, if you enjoy exploring the deep emotional lives of animals and the hidden mysteries of the natural world, please take a moment to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us feed our team of writers and researchers and ensures we can keep bringing you stories that challenge your view of reality and touch your very soul. To comprehend the sheer, staggering terror of the events that unfolded at the Hope River Wildlife Rescue Center, you must first understand the devastating histories of the two souls involved. The sanctuary, located on the shifting borderlands where the dense forests of the Congo Basin slowly give way to the eastern grasslands, was a massive, sprawling haven for animals seized from the illegal exotic pet trade and anti-poaching raids. It was a place where the broken pieces of the animal kingdom were brought to heal. In Sector 4, enclosed behind high tensile wire and deep trenches, lived Moto. Moto was a female cheetah, and her story was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. She had been rescued from a wealthy private collector who had kept her illegally in a concrete courtyard. But the physical confinement was not the source of Moto's profound, agonizing trauma. When the authorities raided the compound, Moto had just given birth to a litter of 4 cubs. In the chaos of the seizure, the smugglers had panicked, packing the cubs into a separate transport box that was subsequently lost in the frantic escape. Moto was brought to the sanctuary alone. For a mother cheetah, the loss of her cubs is a psychological shattering. Cheetahs are incredibly anxious, high-strung predators, and their maternal instincts are fiercely, overwhelmingly powerful. For months, Moto paced the perimeter of her grassy enclosure, day and night, wearing a deep trench into the earth. She refused to eat. She lost her sleek, aerodynamic musculature, becoming a ghostly, skeletal shadow. But the most heartbreaking symptom of her grief was the sound she made. Unlike lions or leopards that roar, cheetahs vocalize with high-pitched bird-like chirps. Every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Moto would sit facing the east and emit a continuous, frantic, agonizing sequence of chirps, a mother crying out into the void for babies that would never answer. The veterinary staff, led by a seasoned, compassionate director named David, tried everything. They tried introducing her to other cheetahs, they tried enrichment programs, but Moto's spirit was fundamentally broken. She was drowning in an ocean of maternal grief that had nowhere to go. Less than half a mile away, in the highly secure, heavily insulated primate nursery, lay the second half of this impossible equation. His name was Kazi. Kazi was a western lowland gorilla infant, barely 3 months old. He had arrived at the sanctuary in the back of a ranger's truck, wrapped in a blood-soaked blanket, the sole survivor of a brutal poaching ambush that had wiped out his entire family in the deep forest. Kazi was impossibly small, a fragile, trembling bundle of dark fuzz, oversized brown eyes, and leathery, wrinkled skin. Gorillas are among the most tactile, socially dependent creatures on the planet. In the wild, a baby gorilla does not leave its mother's body for the first 2 years of its life. It rides on her back, clings to her chest, and regulates its own heartbeat by feeling the deep, steady rhythm of hers. To be separated from that physical contact is a death sentence. Kazi was suffering from profound touch starvation and acute psychological shock. He refused the formula the keepers carefully prepared. He sat in the corner of his specialized heated incubator, his tiny arms wrapped defensively around his knees, staring blankly at the wall with a 1,000-yard stare that broke the hearts of everyone who saw him. David and his team of neonatal nurses worked in rotating shifts, wearing vests made of faux gorilla fur, carrying Kazi in slings 24 hours a day, desperately trying to replicate the warmth and security of the mother he had lost. Slowly, agonizingly, Kazi began to accept the bottle, but he was still hovering on the very edge of the abyss. He was a creature designed for absolute, unbroken connection, stranded in a world of terrifying isolation. The collision of these two broken lives occurred on the night of the worst tropical storm the region had seen in a century. It began late in the afternoon as a heavy, suffocating drop in barometric pressure that made the animals restless and agitated. The sky turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple, and the wind began to howl, tearing through the canopy of the sanctuary with the force of a freight train. By midnight, the rain was falling in solid, horizontal sheets, turning the dirt roads of the sanctuary into churning rivers of red mud. The sheer violence of the storm caused a catastrophic, cascading failure of the sanctuary's infrastructure. Lightning struck the main power grid, plunging the entire facility into absolute, terrifying darkness. The backup generators failed to engage due to flooding in the utility bunker. But the darkness was not the worst of the disaster. Deep in Sector 4, a massive, ancient acacia tree, its roots weakened by the torrential flooding, groaned and snapped. It crashed down with a deafening roar, smashing directly through the high tensile perimeter fence of Moto's enclosure. The massive trunk formed a perfect, chaotic bridge over the security trench, crushing the wire flat against the mud. Moto was terrified by the thunder, her high-strung nervous system overwhelmed by the sensory bombardment. Driven by blind panic and the instinct to flee, the cheetah scrambled over the fallen tree, her claws digging into the wet bark. She slipped through the tangled wire and dropped down into the darkness of the main sanctuary grounds. She was out. She was loose in the storm. Meanwhile, in the primate nursery, chaos was unfolding in the dark. The temperature in the specialized incubators was dropping rapidly without power. A young veterinary nurse named Sarah was on the night shift, frantically trying to wrap the primate infants in thermal blankets and hot water bottles, using only the weak, narrow beam of a battery-powered headlamp to see. The nursery was filled with the frightened, high-pitched whimpers of the infant monkeys and chimpanzees. Kazi was particularly terrified. The booming thunder shook the walls of the clinic, and the baby gorilla was screaming, a raspy, desperate sound, clinging to Sarah's leg with a bruising, frantic grip. Sarah managed to swaddle Kazi tightly in a thick fleece blanket, placing him securely in a deep, padded nesting box, on the examination table while she turned her back to tend to a seizing macaque infant. She was exhausted, soaked to the bone from running between buildings, and entirely focused on the medical crisis unfolding in her hands. She did not hear the soft, metallic click of the nursery's back service door being blown open by a violent gust of wind. She did not hear the soft, almost entirely silent padding of wet paws on the linoleum floor. Moto had been wandering blindly through the storm, seeking shelter from the driving rain. The wind had carried a scent to her highly sensitive nostrils. It wasn't the scent of prey. It was the warm, unmistakable scent of milk, of soft fleece, and of vulnerable tiny lives. Driven by an instinct she could not control, the grieving predator slipped through the open door, her sleek, spotted body pressing low to the ground, melting into the shadows of the unlit clinic. Moto crept past the rows of cages. She heard the whimpers. Her ears twitched, swiveling like radar dishes. The sounds resonated deep within her shattered maternal brain. She reached the examination table where the padded nesting box sat. She rose up on her hind legs, her wet paws resting silently on the edge of the steel table. Her amber eyes, perfectly adapted for night vision, peered into the box. There lay Kazi. The baby gorilla was shivering, his huge brown eyes wide with terror, letting out a soft, rhythmic cry. Moto stared at the strange, dark, hairless creature. It did not look like a cheetah cub. It did not smell like a cheetah cub. But to a mother whose brain had been hijacked by overwhelming, unresolved grief, the visual discrepancies did not matter. What mattered was the vulnerability. What mattered was the cry. It was a baby, and it was alone. Without making a sound, Moto leaned her sleek, aerodynamic head into the box. She opened her jaws designed to crush the windpipes of gazelles at 60 miles an hour. She placed her lethal, razor-sharp teeth around the thick fleece blanket swaddling the baby gorilla. With a gentle, terrifying precision that completely avoided the infant's fragile flesh, she clamped down. Sarah, having stabilized the macaque, turned around, sweeping the beam of her headlamp across the room. The beam caught a flash of spotted fur and the long, sweeping arc of a tail slipping out the back door into the rain. Sarah froze. Her heart stopped completely. She spun the light toward the examination table. The nesting box was empty. "No," Sarah gasped, the air rushing out of her lungs. "Oh my God, no!" She sprinted to the back door, shining her light out into the churning mud and the driving rain. She saw the fresh, distinct paw prints of a large feline pressed deep into the sludge, leading away from the clinic and disappearing into the dense, wild brush that bordered the sanctuary. The prints were accompanied by a drag mark from the fleece blanket. Sarah's screams woke the entire compound. Within minutes, David and a team of heavily armed rangers converged on the clinic. The reality of the situation hit them with the force of a physical blow. A cheetah had breached the nursery. A cheetah had taken the baby gorilla. In the wild, cheetahs are not known as man-eaters, nor are they typically scavengers of primates. But a stressed, panicked predator in a dark, chaotic storm is entirely unpredictable. The immediate, horrifying assumption was that Moto had taken Kazi as prey. The mental image of the fragile, traumatized baby gorilla being torn apart in the dark was too horrific to articulate, but it hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as the team loaded their rifles with live ammunition and heavy tranquilizer darts. "We track her," David commanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound sorrow, his face pale in the flashing red lights of the emergency vehicles. "We find her immediately. If she has hurt him, if she is aggressive, you have authorization to use lethal force. We cannot let that baby suffer." The search was a descent into a nightmare. The rain was washing away the tracks almost as quickly as they were made. The team fanned out, pushing their way through the dense, thorny underbrush, sweeping the beams of their high-powered tactical flashlights through the driving rain. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a surge of adrenaline through their veins. They searched for 2 agonizing, terrifying hours. They checked the culverts, the storage sheds, the deep ravines. They found nothing. The hope of finding Kazi alive was evaporating with every passing minute. Sarah was walking beside David, weeping openly, entirely inconsolable, blaming herself for turning her back, imagining the absolute terror the tiny infant must have felt as he was carried off into the dark. As they pushed deeper into a thick grove of ancient, overgrown bamboo on the far eastern edge of the property, one of the trackers raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. He pointed his light at the ground. There, sheltered from the rain beneath the broad leaves of a giant fern, was a piece of shredded blue fleece. It was the blanket Kazi had been wrapped in. It was torn, soaked in mud, and abandoned. David felt a sickening drop in his stomach. The blanket had been discarded. That usually meant the predator had stopped to feed. He upholstered his tranquilizer pistol, his hands shaking, signaling the team to form a tight, defensive semicircle. They moved forward with agonizing slowness, parting the thick stalks of bamboo, stepping into a small, naturally sheltered hollow created by the massive, tangled roots of an overturned baobab tree. David shone his flashlight into the dark, cavernous hollow beneath the roots. The beam of light illuminated a flash of spotted fur. Moto was there. The cheetah was lying on her side in the dry dirt beneath the overhang of the massive roots. When the bright light hit her eyes, she did not scramble to her feet. She did not hiss. She did not bare her teeth or take a defensive, aggressive posture. Instead, she let out a low, warning rumble and curled her long, sleek body tighter, wrapping her front paws protectively around a small, dark shape tucked tightly against her stomach. David raised his pistol, squinting through the rain, his heart hammering against his ribs. He prepared to fire the dart, praying he wasn't too late to recover whatever was left of the baby. "Hold your fire," Sarah suddenly gasped, grabbing David's arm, pulling his aim down. "David, look! Look at her paws." David adjusted the beam of the flashlight, focusing the intense circle of light directly onto the cheetah's stomach. The entire search team froze in absolute, staggering disbelief. The breath was completely sucked out of the clearing. Several of the hardened rangers lowered their rifles, their jaws dropping open in sheer, unadulterated shock. Moto was not eating the baby gorilla. Kazi was alive. He was completely unharmed. The tiny, fragile primate was nestled deeply into the soft, warm, spotted fur of the cheetah's underbelly. He was no longer shivering. His eyes were closed in peaceful, rhythmic sleep. And, most impossibly of all, Kazi had reached out his tiny, black, humanoid hand and was firmly grasping the cheetah's front leg, holding on to the apex predator exactly as he would have held on to his own mother in the wild. Moto let out a soft, high-pitched chirp. She leaned her sleek head down and began to gently, meticulously lick the mud and rainwater from Kazi's leathery face with her rough, sandpaper-like tongue. She was grooming him. She had carried him through the storm, not as a meal, but as a prize. She had found a dry, safe den, entirely sheltered from the wind and rain. She had carefully removed the wet, restrictive fleece blanket with her teeth, realizing it was cold, and she had pulled the shivering infant against her own body heat to regulate his temperature. The grieving, shattered mother had found the terrified orphaned child. In the dark, terrifying chaos of the storm, across the vast, incomprehensible evolutionary divide that separated the fastest feline on Earth from the great apes of the forest, two broken halves of a soul had miraculously found each other and decided to heal. David slowly lowered his pistol, falling to his knees in the mud, utterly overwhelmed by the profound, beautiful impossibility of what he was witnessing. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, weeping tears of absolute awe, watching the lethal jaws of the cheetah gently resting against the fragile head of the primate. Moto looked at the humans surrounding her den. She did not perceive them as a rescue team. She perceived them as a threat to her new cub. She tightened her grip on Kazi, letting out a deeper, more resonant growl, a mother warning the world to stay away from her baby. The standoff that followed was a delicate, unprecedented negotiation. The veterinary team knew they could not leave Kazi with the cheetah permanently. The biological needs of a growing gorilla, the specific diet, the need for complex primate socialization, the danger of accidental injury from a large feline made it impossible. But they also knew that forcibly tearing the infant away from Moto right now would cause catastrophic psychological trauma to both animals. It would break them completely. David made a decision that defied every standard operating procedure in the Sanctuary Handbook. He ordered the armed rangers to fall back. He sent Sarah back to the clinic to retrieve warm formula, bottles, and a specialized heated transport crate. For the rest of the night, David sat quietly in the mud, 10 feet away from the hollow, speaking in soft, soothing tones to the cheetah, allowing her to realize he was not going to attack. As dawn broke, painting the storm-ravaged sanctuary in soft golden light, Sarah returned. She slowly approached the den, holding the warm bottle of milk. Moto watched her warily, her ears pinned back, but she did not strike. Sarah sat down in the mud next to David. She held out the bottle. Kazi, smelling the milk, stirred. He opened his huge brown eyes, looked at Sarah, and let out a hungry whimper. He untangled his tiny fingers from Moto's fur and stumbled clumsily out from under the cheetah's protective embrace, walking toward the bottle. Moto let out a frantic chirp. She stood up, her muscles tensed, ready to grab him back. "It's okay, Moto," David whispered, holding his hands out, keeping his voice incredibly calm. "We're just going to feed him. You did so good. You saved him." Kazi reached Sarah, eagerly grabbing the bottle with both hands, drinking greedily. As he drank, Sarah gently wrapped him in a dry, warm blanket. Moto paced at the edge of the hollow, watching intently, letting out soft, anxious chirps. She was distressed, but the sheer panic of losing her cubs was slightly muted. She had experienced the physical sensation of mothering again. She had protected a life. The frantic, obsessive pacing of her grief had been broken by a night of profound purpose. With agonizing care, Sarah placed the sleeping, fed baby gorilla into the heated transport crate. David slowly stood up, looking into the amber eyes of the cheetah. He didn't lock her in. He didn't dart her. He simply backed away, allowing the sanctuary staff to repair her enclosure later that day, giving her the space to process the night. The story of the cheetah who kidnapped the baby gorilla to save him from the storm became a legend that echoed far beyond the walls of the sanctuary. It fundamentally altered the way the veterinary staff viewed the emotional capacity of the predators in their care. It shattered the arrogant, clinical assumption that wild animals are merely biological machines driven solely by instinct and hunger. Kazi went on to thrive, eventually integrating into a surrogate troop of rescued gorillas, growing into a massive, confident juvenile. Moto's recovery was slow, but the night she spent mothering Kazi was the turning point in her rehabilitation. She stopped her frantic, nightly chirping. She began to eat again. She found a strange, quiet peace, eventually forming a bond with a retired, older male cheetah in an adjacent enclosure. What happened in the dark, muddy hollow beneath the baobab tree forces us to re-examine everything we think we know about the natural world. We draw lines between species, we categorize them as predator and prey, as violent and gentle. But nature is vastly more complex and infinitely more beautiful than our rigid definitions allow. When the lights go out and the storms rage, when the world is stripped down to its absolute, most terrifying core, empathy is not a luxury reserved for human beings. It is a universal, undeniable heartbeat that pulses through the veins of every living creature on this earth. Moto proved that grief is a language every mother speaks, and that the instinct to protect the fragile, to comfort the terrified, and to love the abandoned is the most powerful, unbreakable force in the entire animal kingdom.